Abel slept for 14 hours. When his eyes opened, he was startled to find he was not where he ought to be, that is, in bed with his wife Amanda. There was no wife, there were no walls, there was only a dazzling brightness and a landscape such as he had never seen. It was mid-afternoon. As always after a hurricane, the atmosphere was crystal clear. He was now able to see his boat, the piece of board with the rusty nail that had probably saved his life. It was lodged in the uppermost branches of a tree that was mainly submerged in the river. Above was an endless cerulean blue. Below, water flowed swiftly, sparkling like champagne in the sun. The water was all round him, but some distance to his left and some distance to his right, more trees stuck up out of the water, and beyond the trees on both sides the ground rose into wooded hills. Turning around, he saw behind him the waterfall over which he had plunged. His trees seemed to be in the middle of the river. There was no doubt he was on an island. The rain must have ended shortly after he fell asleep, and during that time the flood had crested. It had already subsided some, or else he would not be as far above the water as he was. He would be able to descend to solid ground when the river fell farther. He stood up, stretching, and winced. All his muscles ached. He had to sit down again. He wished Amanda was with him, or better yet, he with her. As far as he could tell, apart from the trees, he was the only living thing between the horizons. He let out his loudest "Hallo!" then listened. There was no response, not even an echo. The state of his clothes disturbed him. Damp and lumpy. They no longer had style. That would be corrected as soon as possible. He stared into the distance and speculated. They're all wondering where I am, of course. Many I don't even know are wondering. It's certainly gotten around that Abelard Hassan de Chirico Flint of the Mossville Flints is missing. It is distressing to consider the misery and anxiety his absence was causing those who cared. Search parties were surely out, but they wouldn't be anywhere near him. How could they even begin to guess what had happened? That, by freak chance, rain had formed a rivulet around a sort of boat he had boarded accidentally. That was the rivulet, swelling. It had taken him into a stream. The stream had carried him into a river. The river had rushed him over a waterfall, and that he was now where he was, on a boat at the top of a tree on an island in whatever river this was. When the water subsided, he would descend and go home, and what a story he'd have to tell. Meanwhile, he wished he had something to eat. A mushroom omelet, for example, with buttered garlic toast. Being hungry in addition to being marooned like this was really a bit too much. Absent-minded, he nibbled at a twig on his branch. Ah, cherry birch, one of his favorite flavors. The familiar taste made him feel a little more at home on his roost in the middle of nowhere. He munched on the bark of a tender green root, his cheek filled with the pulp and the juice. He was eating. He sat there vaguely smug, convinced that he had the strength, the courage, and the intelligence to survive. His eyes glazed over, and he returned to sleep. Chapter 4. Abel awoke early in the morning, a new mouse, after his second spell of healing slumber. Stretching felt good. It struck him that his landscape had changed. There were trees in his vicinity all around him. His boat had been stopped by a towering one near the river's edge. Looking below, he saw that his tree towered, not only because it was tall, but because it stood on a rocky prominence. The water had returned to its proper level. In many places the grass was flattened, half buried in silt and gravel. Otherwise, it seemed a normal world. He climbed to the very top of his tree and made a survey. He was indeed on an island. He could see the waterfall and river above. He was on one side of the island, by one fork of the river, and through the trees he could make out the fork on the opposite side. Way below, he could see where the two forks joined. No one was anywhere visible. It was time to be getting home. He started descending to the birch, and in another moment he was grinning like an idiot. He was climbing down a tree he had never climbed up. Amanda would enjoy hearing about this. She had a good sense of humor, almost as sharp as his. How good to be standing on solid earth again. He did some quick knee bends and ran around the tree just for the joy of the free movement. Then he sat on a stone, his elbows on his knees, and looked up and down the river. Perhaps by now they had managed to figure out what had happened to him and would be turning up in a boat or something after all. He waited, and to keep himself amused, he hummed snatches of his favorite cantata and imagined how he would narrate his adventures. He would be quite matter-of-fact, especially about the parts where he had shown courage and endurance. He would leave the staring and gasping to his audience. No one turned up, and Abel realized he'd been expecting too much. They'd never look for him here. Well, he would have to cross the river one way or another. He ran to the other side of the island. Perhaps the river was narrow there. It was wider. He ran back. He removed his shoes and socks, rolled up his trousers, and waded in the water to try the current. No. It would be impossible to reach the far shore by swimming, even though he was a competent swimmer. The rush of water was much too strong. He'd be dashed against a rock or dragged under and drowned. He needed a boat of some sort. How about his board and nail? Perhaps he could do something with that. He climbed a tree, dislodged the board, and followed it down where it fell to the ground. He stood over it, muttering to himself, thoughtfully fingering a filament of his mustache. How could he navigate this crude piece of wood? With a rudder. If he held the rudder at an acute angle, the boat would gradually work its way to the opposite shore. That would be bending the power of the stream to his own ends. With a stick, he scratched a diagram in the sand. It was a long rectangle, the river crossed by a long diagonal, the course his boat would take. He should eventually land on the other side, much farther downstream. He was pleased with the way his mind was working. He managed to tear a flat strip of wood from a nearby log and with his pearl-handled penknife whittled a shapely handle. The nail would help him keep the rudder firmly in position. Now he put on his shoes and socks, arranged his clothes as neatly as he could, and edged his boat into the water. It was really much too long since he'd seen Amanda. Since their wedding day, they had not been apart for as much as a day. He got aboard, pushed off from the shore with his rudder, and quickly braced it against the nail, holding the handle firmly in his paws. The rudder worked. He was moving away from the bank. Then the boat reached the powerful current farther out. It began to bobble and buck. Abel's rudder shuddered in his paws, though he used all his strength to hold it steady. His knees bobbled and bucked with the boat as it sped along, snaking its way in the writhing grooves of the stream. It pitched left, then right. Then the rudder was wrenched from his grasp, and now he was no longer a helmsman, but a stunned passenger on a bit of flotsam at the mercy of the rampaging water. His boat skedaddled up to a rock, hit it catty-cornered, and spun, and Abel was sailing on the water without his boat, borne along like a limp rag. By good fortune, instead of being carried past the island and down the river, he was able to catch hold of a low-hanging streamer of weeping willow and pull himself ashore. The whole ordeal had lasted just 1 minute. He ambled back to his starting point near the cherry birch, his toes turned awkwardly in. The mess of wet clothes he wore added to his sense of ineptitude and shame. He was used to their being dry and pressed. Where had he erred, he wondered. He should have bound the rudder to the nail, of course. He had been too hasty in his preparations. He had underestimated the force of the rapids. He would have to design and build a real boat, not a raft like the piece of board that had just quit his company. Perhaps it should be a sailboat. His jacket might serve as a sail. The rudder this time would be firmly secured through a hole in the stern. The sailboat so clearly envisioned, some confidence returned. He felt a bit proud even in his wet pants. He found a piece of driftwood somewhat disgusting since it had been gnawed and bored and channeled by lower forms of life. But he couldn't afford to be overly sensitive now. He dragged the driftwood to the edge of the water. It would be the bottom of his boat. He washed his paws. Next he peeled 3 large sections of bark from a dead tree and shaped them for the sides by bending and breaking them on the straight edge of a rock. He collected a great deal of tough grass and fashioned lengths of rope by tying the ends together. When he thought he had enough of this rope, he began cutting grooves in the driftwood. It was slow work with the small pen knife. Not thinking, he fell to using his teeth. What? He drew back for a moment in revulsion. Then he continued to gnaw away. He had never before gnawed at anything but food. But the grooves were done in no time. He didn't honestly mind the taste of the somewhat decayed wood. He fitted the bark into the grooves and then went to work, lashing everything together, going round and round with the rope and over and under until his boat could hardly be seen for what it really was under all the lashings. Now he gathered a heap of soft grass, and with stone and stick for hammer and chisel, tamped it into all the crevices to prevent leakage. He was pleased with his ingenuity. He had never built a boat before. In fact, though he was a married mouse, he had never built anything or done a day's work. However, he watched others working, so ideas came to him readily. When he finished his caulking, he made a mast with a crosspiece or boom out of branches. The mast was inserted among the numerous lashings and fastened with more. He made a rudder like the first, put it through a hole in the stern as he had planned, and surveyed the completed boat. Considering the crude materials and the lack of tools, he had to admit it was a fine piece of work. Too bad the bright day was his only witness. Before dressing the mast with his jacket where it hung like a scarecrow's slack raiment, he removed from the inner pocket Amanda's scarf, the bit of beloved gauze that accounted for his being where he was. He kissed the piece of fluff and tucked it inside his shirt. A favorable breeze was drifting across the island toward the shore opposite. It seemed a good omen. He looked back in a farewell glance at this remote part of the world's geography that had given him shelter for 2 nights. Then he shoved his ship into the water and leaped aboard, grabbing the tail of his coat with one paw, the rudder with the other. Boat number 2 fared worse than the first. The stream was too swift and the breeze too light for the sail to be effective. The boat swung around despite the rudder, hit a rock, and shattered. Luckily, Abel was pitched into a pebbled shallow and managed to scramble ashore, where he stood and watched his jacket and the wreck of his ship go the way of the river. Freeing his clothes, he made his way back to the birch, which had become his center of operations. He resented the stream and meant to best it. Abel grimly decided that in his next effort he would not count on a rudder. Rudders were too dependent on the behavior of wayward water. Nor would he count on a sail because wind was fickle. He would rely only on the strength of his own 2 arms. He had seen water striders, those insects that support themselves in swift streams on long legs kept wide apart. He would build a sort of water strider, a catamaran, and row it. Excited by this new idea, he quickly put together a catamaran of crisscross sticks in the form of a pyramid, tying the sticks together wherever they crossed. Next, using that remarkable, newly discovered tool, his rodent teeth, he made 2 long oars or sweeps, which he placed in notches he had gnawed out for oar locks. In a sporting spirit, he tied his handkerchief to the top of the pole as a pennant. Convinced he had finally solved the problem of conquering the stream, he launched his craft and climbed into the captain's seat with his oars. The moment they touched the water, they were wrenched from his grasp, and the river took over once more. Once more, he foundered on a rock, and once more barely managed to scramble back up on the island. He was beginning to feel he owed his wife, the whole world, an explanation. He wished he could let them all know what was delaying him.